Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales About History. I'm your host, Mike Allen. Rochambeau, he commands a lot of attention in America when it comes to talking about how the French helped us win our independence against the British. And rightly so, he played a hugely significant role. But there was another Frenchman who played a very significant role. He was named the Marquis de Lafayette. In fact, the stories surrounding his exploits are nothing short of phenomenal. Somebody who knows this better than most is our guest today, Jan O'Sullivan. Jan's on the board of the American Friends of Lafayette, and she's also the associate editor of their newsletter. Jan knows these fascinating stories inside and out, and she's going to be along in a moment to share them with us. This week's trivia question: when parachuting, he would sever the ropes to his parachute cords in midair with a machete, alarming the crowds below. Who was this daredevil? Stay tuned after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know what we're talking about in next week's show. Now, before we get into this week's show, I want to take just a little bit of time to tell you about something new that's on my website. A lot of times people have come up to me and said they're overwhelmed about the fact that I've got now more than 200 episodes of Amazing Tales on my website, and they have trouble sometimes finding the episodes that are of the highest interest to them. Well, now there's a way to sort through all that. If you go to my website, you're going to find that I've added a special Excel spreadsheet. It contains all of the episodes dating all the way back to the beginning in 2021. Now, to get to the spreadsheet, you just go to my website, amazingtalesct.com. You scroll down on the homepage, and on the right side of the homepage, you'll see a red box. You can't miss it. Just click on that box, and you'll be taken right to the spreadsheet. Now, you'll be able to search by topic or by town, and there are 35 topics and 118 municipalities. You'll be able to see, for example, what topics have been done about your town. Now, if you have any trouble with any of this, just drop me a line at amazingtalesct@gmail.com. All right, let's get back to the main event, which is Lafayette. He was an amazing person. Seriously, difficult to overstate how much this very wealthy Frenchman contributed to the Patriots winning the American Revolution. And he also distinguished himself along the way on the battlefield. Now, we're not just talking about all the money he spent, but he really had cunning when it came to military exercises. We have a great guest today to tell us this story of heroics. She is Jan O'Sullivan. Jan's a member of the board of the American Friends of Lafayette organization. She's also the associate editor of their official newsletter. One of the many things her group has been doing to raise awareness about Lafayette is actually retracing his steps during his farewell tour around a very different United States some 200 years ago, back in 1824 and 1825, and this is a significant undertaking. Well, there's so much to cover about Lafayette, so many great stories, so let's just get going. He started life in France in, I think, 1757 or thereabouts, was born. And by the time he was, I think, 13 or 15 at the latest, his parents had died, and he had inherited this incredible wealth and somehow decided he was in favor of going to America and helping the revolutionaries fight the British. What do we know about why he did that?
Well, in 1775, he's off in his father-in-law's battalion in Metz, France. So he's like not even 18. He is married at that point. He got married at age 16. His wife was 14, to a very influential family. So he's bored in the army. They're not at war. It's not exciting. Back at home, his in-laws are so influential. They're part of the French court. He doesn't love that either. Also, he's a product of the Enlightenment. So he hears actually from the younger brother of King George III at a dinner in Metz that the Americans are fighting, Lexington and Concord have happened. He hears about that and he's enchanted. He wants to go do that from the minute he hears about it. He's very wealthy. He inherited a lot of money. He's the wealthiest young man in France. So he has the wherewithal to buy his own ship, which he optimistically names La Victoire, Victory. And he also meets Silas Deane in France, who is recruiting French people to go over, possibly overstepping his bounds because he tells Lafayette, yeah, definitely you can be a major general. He buys the ship. He has to get out of France because the king and his powerful father-in-law don't want him to do this. But he does. He sneaks out of France. He was disguised. There's some talk out there. You'll hear he was disguised as a woman. That's probably not true. But he has to pick up the ship in Spain because if he's seen leaving from France, he could get arrested. So he does. He leaves a pregnant wife and a toddler, writes an apologetic note to his wife, Adrienne, and he sails for America. The voyage takes 6 weeks. He learns English, and he's seasick the entire time. He lands in South Carolina, and it takes 4 weeks for him to get to Philadelphia, where Congress is. So he gets there, and he presents himself to Congress, and they are like, oh, great, another young Frenchman seeking glory. What are we going to do with this kid? But he has a letter from Ben Franklin. He is well connected to the French court. They realize that. And he also says, I will serve at my own expense. And that was music to their ears. So they give him the title of Major General, but they intend it to be merely a decorative title. They're not going to give him troops or anything. But he does meet Washington. Washington is quite taken with him, and I think that they quickly develop a paternalistic bond. Washington has no biological children of his own. He's about the age that Lafayette's father would be. His father was killed in the Battle of Minden in the 7 Years' War when Lafayette wasn't even 2 yet. So Washington says, I want you to be part of my family, meaning his military family. Lafayette thinks he's being adopted, but they work it out, figure it out, and they become very, very close friends. And Lafayette becomes a trusted member of Washington's inner circle.
Now, it's not even 2 months after that fabled meeting of Washington that he's at the Battle of Brandywine, he meaning Lafayette, and baptism under fire, right?
Yeah, he still doesn't have troops. He wants troops, but they're not doing well in this battle. So they're like, well, we might as well send Lafayette in and see what he can do. So he goes in and he kind of rallies the troops to get them to stop running from the battle, but it's a lost cause. So he organizes an orderly retreat of the troops so they can live to fight another day. In the course of the battle, though, he's hit in the leg with a musket ball. Blood is pouring out of his boot by the time he gets off the battlefield. So they take him to get medical attention, and Washington tells the doctor, treat him as if he were my son. Also, James Monroe is there. He's roughly Lafayette's age, and he gives Lafayette a little pep talk because he has recovered from a wound from a year ago in the Battle of Trenton. Lafayette goes off, recuperates with the Moravians, and rejoins the battles about 2 months later.
So now he is going to spend the winter in Valley Forge, the famous winter where it was just so bitterly cold and they didn't even have enough blankets to stay warm and not enough food and all of those stories. And Washington sends Lafayette, this is remarkable, with 2,200 men to do a reconnaissance mission. He gets surrounded by 4 top British generals. Pick up the story.
He's been up to upstate New York where he was given instructions to invade Canada. But he takes one look at the army up there and he says, I can't invade Canada. These guys don't have clothes or shoes. They haven't been paid. They're sickly. But while he's up there, he does recruit 47 Oneida warriors to be soldiers. And so when he takes Barron Hill and he's up on this hill, he's got 47 Oneida soldiers with him, but he gets surrounded by the British and he's got to get off of Barron Hill. Fortunately, the Oneidas ambush the British a bunch to slow them down. There's a gap that Lafayette makes a strategic retreat with his troops, so they live to fight another day again. The British were hoping to get a good supply chain and communications channel into Philadelphia, which they do not accomplish, so they end up leaving Philadelphia the following month.
This is remarkable. This is actually called one of the most incredible escapes in military history, right? What he did.
Yeah, it is. They call it Lafayette Hill now. Actually, it's not Barron Hill anymore. It raises Lafayette's military profile quite a bit that he pulled this brilliant thing off.
He has seen enough. He has realized that there is an issue. And of course, now the Americans or the revolutionaries know that he's got this connection to the court in France. And so he is sent back to see if they can fast forward some of the support from the French king that everybody thought was coming, correct?
Right. The French king is more willing to get involved in this point. And fast forwarding takes about a year for Lafayette to set everything up when he goes back. But he does go back. Now, keep in mind, when he left the first time, he snuck out and he was told not to go. So when he comes back, he has to be punished by the king. So the king puts him on house arrest in his father-in-law's lovely mansion with his family. And so it's for a week. So it's just a slap on the wrist. And then he gets to present himself at court and he starts organizing, eventually becomes the French expeditionary force that comes over. Now, Lafayette's hoping that he'll lead that force back to America, but he doesn't get to do that. He's still only 22, so Rochambeau is given that honor. He's more seasoned. He spends a whole year, as I said, and his son, George Washington Lafayette, is born that year. And note the name, he names his son after George Washington.
He comes back to the United States. Rochambeau comes back to the United States. And Lafayette almost plays a little matchmaker game, right, in Hartford between Washington and Rochambeau?
Yeah, well, he introduces them and acts as an interpreter in Hartford when they meet.
And then he goes down to Virginia because Washington wants him to stop Cornwallis from sort of ravaging the state of Virginia. And so he goes off down there. And meanwhile, they have Rochambeau and Washington, a big conference in Wethersfield, right?
Right. So they're in Wethersfield, Connecticut, deciding if they're going to try to take New York or keep going south. And they keep their options open for a while. They've got Lafayette playing cat and mouse with the British to keep them in Virginia, in the Yorktown area, because it's going to take a while to move those troops from New York down to Virginia.
Now, there's a little sidebar to history that a lot of people aren't aware of in the Battle of Yorktown, which was the British who were getting a little bit nervous at this point, realizing things were not going their way. They actually had some slaves amongst them who had smallpox. And this was almost one of the starts of germ warfare in battles where they sent some of these slaves over to the French and colonial side to see if they could infect those members. It was kind of a Hail Mary attempt to try and slow them down. But that didn't work, and the Battle of Yorktown, of course, was successful, and the war ended, and on we go.
Fortunately, Lafayette had been inoculated against smallpox when he was very young. Meanwhile, Lafayette has an enslaved person named James acting as a double agent for him. He recognized James could do this, and he said, James, I want you to pretend you're an escaped slave and tell the British you're looking to get your freedom. So he ends up spying on Cornwallis for Lafayette, and Cornwallis thinks that James is spying on Lafayette. So Lafayette is sending bad information with James and getting back good information on what's going on with the British. Unfortunately, James doesn't get his freedom at the end of the revolution because he was a spy. The soldiers could get their freedom under certain circumstances, but James was a spy. But Lafayette intercedes a few years later, and a few years after that, James gets his freedom and he takes the surname Lafayette.
So after the war, at the time, he was a celebrity in the United States, and he came back for a farewell tour after the revolution. Tell us about that.
He's actually invited by now President Monroe, remember the guy with the wound, gave him the pep talk. President Monroe invites Lafayette to come back to the United States. There's 24 states at the time, and there's a very contentious election going on, and we're still not cohesive. But the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence is coming up in like 2 years from then. And Monroe thinks Lafayette's such a celebrity, he'll reignite patriotic fervor. And also, there's a generation now that didn't live through the Revolutionary War. They don't get it. So they're trying to revive this patriotism. And Lafayette readily agrees to come over. He arrives in New York to great fanfare in the middle of August. And there are tens of thousands of people there to greet him. Think of like the Beatles, except there was less than 10,000 people to greet the Beatles. Tenfold more people to greet Lafayette than the Beatles when they landed. So it was a big deal. His intent is to spend 3 or 4 months and visit all the 13 original colonies that he's familiar with from being here, He ends up getting so many invitations that he stays for 13 months. He travels 6,000 miles on every kind of conveyance you can imagine. What he's doing, he's trying to get back to Boston because when he was there in end of August of 1824, they're like, if you come back in next June, it's going to be the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill. We're laying a cornerstone for a stone monument, and we would be honored if you would lay the cornerstone.
So now, of course, long before that, shortly after the Revolutionary War, he had gone back to France. And, as interesting as the American Revolution was for the French, it was really their own revolution that occurred right after the American Revolution that, sort of dominates that time period for them. And Lafayette played a key role in that, right? I mean, this is no small role. Tell us what he did on Bastille Day and helping there.
The Bastille is stormed. Lafayette is like head of the National Guard in Paris. He's actually the one that orders the Bastille to be destroyed afterwards, but he keeps the key and he sends it via Thomas Paine to George Washington, who at the time is president. So George keeps it with him and then brings it back to Mount Vernon at the end of his presidency and hangs it in his front corridor. That's where it is to this day. So being commander-in-chief of the Parisian National Guard, his job is to ensure the safety of the king and the queen. And when Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette try to escape the country without telling Lafayette, after that, he starts to fall from favor. And then he leaves France in order to save his own head. He is arrested by the Austrians and imprisoned for about 5 years. His wife is also imprisoned, but actually she's trying to petition for his release, and she's not successful in that. So she offers to go be imprisoned with him and takes their 2 daughters and spends the last 2 years of his imprisonment with him. And you can just imagine the scene. Lafayette has been in solitary confinement, and so one day the door opens and there's his wife and 2 daughters. His son, meanwhile, had been sent to George Washington for safekeeping, kind of. So he's at Mount Vernon, so he won't lose his head. And it's a little bit of a dilemma for George Washington, who doesn't want to get involved in the French Revolution, but he does take George Washington and Lafayette in. And so they all end up being safe. I should also mention that early in the French Revolution, Lafayette drafts the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And Thomas Jefferson's in Paris at the time, and he helps Lafayette edit it. This is still part of the French Constitution today.
He was enlightened as well, very supportive of women's rights, which was rather unusual at that point in time.
Yes, he was. He considered women intellectual equals. He grew up around a lot of women. When his father died, he was with his mother, his grandmother, his aunts. During his farewell tour, he made a point of visiting some institutions of learning that were dedicated to educating women.
The final chapter of his life, of course, he passes away, and there's just a great story around his gravesite, and I'd love for you to share that with us.
He's buried in Picpus Cemetery in Paris. And the story is that the cemetery came into being because his wife Adrienne, at the end of the Reign of Terror, lost her mother, grandmother, and sister to the guillotine. They were buried in a mass grave along with many others. So Adrienne buys the land that the mass grave is on, and she convinces the nearby nuns to establish a cemetery and take care of it. Also, the story is then when Lafayette is buried, he's buried under American soil. And you will hear that he brought back soil from Bunker Hill. There's no contemporaneous evidence that he picked up soil at Bunker Hill and brought some back, although it's certainly plausible. He was there for the cornerstone laying. There would have been loose dirt. He probably could have taken some back. But we do have some documentation that in 1829, somebody that Lafayette had met at another cornerstone laying ceremony in Brooklyn for a library, he was a native of Charlestown, Massachusetts, and he assures Lafayette that he'll get him some soil. So he requests of the selectmen of Charleston permission to fill a hogshead, which is a barrel, of soil from Bunker Hill, and they agree. And the local newspaper, the Bunker Hill Aurora, reports that when the Charlestown selectmen agree to this, they note that, quote, the earth will be taken from near the spot where General Joseph Warren fell, and the earth that drank the blood of Warren will surround the body of Lafayette. We'll fast forward a little bit to 1917. The U.S. gets involved in World War I. And the first thing they do when they land there, General Pershing marches with his men to Picpus Cemetery on July 4th. That's where Pershing's aide, Colonel Stanton, says the famous line, Lafayette, we are here. In other words, we're repaying what you did for our country.
Now, there's an American flag that flies over Lafayette's grave in Paris. Jan says she believes it's the only place in Paris where an American flag flies continuously, as it did even during the German occupation. Of course, we couldn't let the episode end without saying what was perhaps Lafayette's greatest contribution during the Revolutionary War. When it came to the decisive Battle of Yorktown at the end, Washington and Rochambeau's troops were marching to the south to get there, and it was Lafayette and his team that contained Cornwallis and the British troops on the peninsula where Yorktown is located, allowing Washington and Rochambeau to get there and ultimately win victory. It's also worth noting that by some estimates, the number of towns and streets in the U.S. that were named after Lafayette rival the number of such locations associated with people like George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson. As an example, Fayetteville, North Carolina is actually named after Lafayette, and of course so is Lafayette College. That's going to wrap up this episode of Amazing Tales About History. One last Lafayette fact. His portrait hangs in the hall of the United States House of Representatives in Washington to the left of the Speaker's rostrum. Not even Rochambeau got that honor. And the portrait hanging to the right in the U.S. House of Representatives, well, of course, it's George Washington. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Jan O'Sullivan, board member of the American Friends of Lafayette and associate editor of their newsletter. The answer to this week's trivia question: when parachuting, he would sever the ropes to his parachute cords in midair with a machete, alarming the crowds below. Who was this daredevil? Well, his name was J.J. Fanning, and he came from West Haven, Connecticut. Next week on Amazing Tales, we're going to speak with the man who has rekindled J.J. Fanning's unbelievable Evel Knievel-type exploits. And he should know J.J. Fanning pretty well. After all, Fanning was his relative. Amazing Tales About History is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.